You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got some major news about Rudy Giuliani. He conceded that he did make defamatory statements about Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, the Georgia poll workers who testified for the January 6th committee. Can you give a breakdown of what happened here?
Yeah, so this is kind of a shocking admission coming in the middle of a defamation lawsuit brought by Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss to Georgia state election poll workers who were just savaged by the lies of Rudy Giuliani and of Donald Trump. For Rudy Giuliani to file something in that case saying, yes, I admit I lied about Shay Moss, about Ruby Freeman, and those lies were defamatory. He has basically given up 95% of what Ruby and Shay would have to have proven in order to hold him liable for the defamation. So, I mean, this really is a blockbuster admission by Rudy Giuliani and his attorney, though not at all surprising, because we saw Rudy Giuliani lie over and over and over again to the extreme detriment of those two women, both of whom testified before the January 6th committee, and they related in painful, excruciating detail the damage that Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump did to their lives.
Now, Giuliani is saying that he defamed them, but it didn't cause damages. So is he basically just trying to evade financial penalties here because causing damage is one of the tenets that has to be proven in a defamation case?
Yeah, Brian, on the one hand, he's trying not to give up the entire farm in the litigation by saying, well, sure, I lied about them. Sure, these lies were defamatory, but, they didn't really suffer any damages. So he wants to fight on the battleground of how bad his lies were, how dangerous, how damaging to their emotional well-being, their pain and suffering, their financial prospects of being employed gainfully in the future. And here's the question that I have to ask. If these two victims, right, Ruby and Shay, if they were wealthy white women of means, would Rudy have been saying, you know what, I may have lied about these two women, but come on, they didn't suffer any damages. One of the things he said about them over and over again, when, the video of the vote counting was disclosed, he said, look at them. They look like drug dealers, don't they? Kind of surreptitiously moving these papers around when in fact it was proven by authorities over and over again, all these two women were doing was what they were supposed to be doing, counting votes and putting them precisely where they were supposed to put them. Rudy accused them of looking like drug dealers, doing something dirty. Would he have done that if these were two wealthy white men or women of means, of influence, with some connection, with some power? I venture to say not. So what Rudy did to those two women is despicable in so many ways. And boy, I hope they take every penny this little lying man may have left.
Yeah, and by the way, I specifically remember watching the entirety of the January 6th committee hearings, and that day struck me like none other, because not only were these women not doing anything wrong, they were doing their civic duty. They were doing what we need people to do. Otherwise, the whole election apparatus comes crashing down. Thank God for these women who were only to then turn around and have their lives turned upside down by not only Rudy Giuliani, but the president of the United States. But Glenn, I guess the question is it not insane that Rudy Giuliani is making himself the arbiter of whether these women that he defamed, that he admitted that he defamed, and caused the president of the United States of America to defame, that sure, he lied, but his lies weren't really enough to hurt their reputations, because what reputations do they have? Like, who the fuck is this guy to make himself the decider of whether their reputational harm was enough to warrant making him pay any money?
Brian, their testimony before the January 6th House Select Committee could not have been more emotional or gut-wrenching. They said because of the lies that Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump told about them, they couldn't go out. They couldn't go to the grocery store. They didn't want anybody to know that they were the Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman. that Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump were accusing of, acting unlawfully, trying to undermine the results of the election in Georgia. And Rudy Giuliani said, you know what? I may have lied about them, but what kind of damages could two people like that suffer? I mean, read between the lines there. What do you think motivates a Rudy Giuliani to say something like that about these two women? And here's the other thing, Brian. Donald Trump, in his dirty call to then Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, find me 11,780 votes and just corruptly declare me the winner of the election in Georgia. He mentioned Ruby Freeman 18 times, 18, while he tried to coerce and threaten Brad Raffensperger into corruptly throwing him the election. I mean, Ruby Moss was like the marquee, wrongdoer, according to Donald Trump. Look at her. She's the one who helped steal votes from me and give them to Joe Biden. This is something for which Rudy Giuliani and ultimately Donald Trump must be made to account. And with the indictments coming in Georgia in August, I suspect they will be held to account.
Now, based on something you just alluded to, I know that this defamation case, is separate between Freeman and Moss and Giuliani, but will this factor into the special counsel's case into January 6th or the Fulton County, Georgia case?
Both. And here's why. Rudy Giuliani just went on record in a legal pleading in a case in federal court saying, I lied about election fraud in Georgia and election workers in Georgia. That's an admission, right? That I suspect. Now, it gets a little bit dicey because he's going to say, well, this was a representation of my lawyer. It didn't come out of my mouth. You know what? I would fight that legal battle all day, every day, and say, no, this is an admission by the client. And this pleading was authorized to be filed by the client. And it should be held against the client, not only in that civil defamation suit, but in criminal cases. So I suspect you're going to see this admission make a showing one way or another, certainly in Fani Willis's investigation of election fraud in Georgia, not by Ruby and Shea, election fraud by Giuliani and Trump and others. And I suspect you're also going to see it be used and be viewed as relevant evidence in Jack Smith's investigation into all things January 6th.
With that said, how will this impact Rudy Giuliani's ability to practice law?
What ability to practice law? He has had his law license suspended in New York, in Washington, D.C., pending permanent revocation in both jurisdictions. Rudy is done. I don't think he could get a license to be a hot dog vendor at this point.
Yeah, okay. Glenn, what does this say about the Georgia situation more broadly that Giuliani lied? Like, legal stuff aside, because Giuliani's lies were a predicate for so much of what Trump then used moving forward with the big lie, what does this say about the big picture here?
Here's what it says. It says that, even though indictments have been very long coming, right? We've been waiting forever for accountability to come for what Donald Trump and John Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, and Jeffrey Clark and Bannon and Stone and Flynn and the rest of them, what they have done with evidence like this. I don't want to say that conviction is a certainty, because there is no such thing as a sure winner once we are in court, engaged in battle, prosecution against the defense. But the evidence of wrongdoing, the evidence of crime by Trump, Giuliani, and company is so overwhelming that once we get a fair and impartial jury impaneled in each and every case, and we can, and we will. I impaneled juries for 30 years. We're going to get a fair and impartial jury. It's going to be like shooting fish in a barrel. Like, novice prosecutors could walk in with this evidence into a state court in Georgia, into a federal court in D.C., and convict Trump, Giuliani, and others in their sleep, because at the end of the day, the evidence is just that strong.
And let's finish off with this. Glenn, I know there's no precedent for any of this, but in terms of damages that Freeman and Moss might be entitled to, is there anything analogous that we could look toward to have any indication of what what Giuliani might be on the line for, might be on the hook for?
Yeah, I mean, the damage that he did, the emotional pain and suffering these women not only suffered, but testified about. I mean, if you could watch their January 6th House Select Committee testimony without shedding a tear, then I wonder how much, emotion you have in you.
Mm.
Not to mention their financial prospects. I mean, they loved, this is their testimony, being poll workers, being part of the Democratic process, supporting our free and fair elections. And they said, we certainly can't do that anymore. I mean, I think the sky's the limit. You're going to see a judgment against Rudy Giuliani in the millions and millions of dollars.
And what happens if Giuliani doesn't have the money? I mean, you alluded to the fact that Giuliani really doesn't have a few pennies to rub together. What happens if he doesn't have the money in front of him, but but they're owed this money from him?
Everything that he has, every asset, every stream of income will be attached or garnished by a court, and payments will be made over time. Here's the other thing to remember. Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss also brought suits against various faux news agencies and organizations. They all settled. What does that tell us? That tells us that they probably paid a pretty penny to get out of their defamation suits. And Rudy is like the last cruddy man standing. So hopefully they already have, some damages, some monetary damages that have come their way from these other organizations that paid to get out of their defamation suits.
All right. Well, obviously, we'll stay on top of this as soon as we have any update. So for those watching, if you want to stay on top of this stuff, as soon as any of the news breaks, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.